Judge Thomas Avery had always prided himself on his ability to remain impartial. For over a decade, he had presided over cases in a city known for its diversity. His reputation as a no-nonsense judge had earned him respect, but his rulings were often met with mixed reactions. He saw himself as a firm believer in justice, and he believed that everyone, regardless of background, should be treated equally in his courtroom. But on this particular day, something felt different. Simone Carter, standing before him, wasn't the typical defendant. She was a poised, confident black woman in her mid-30s, wearing a simple but elegant outfit that spoke volumes about her self-respect. There was a calm aura about her, an energy that suggested she was accustomed to challenges but didn't let them define her. She had been cited for a minor traffic violation. Nothing serious, but enough for a fine. However, as Judge Avery listened to her speak, offering a brief, polite explanation of the circumstances, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of impatience. It was subtle but unmistakable. Simone was respectful. Her words were measured and direct. There was no defensiveness, no frustration in her tone. She simply presented the facts, and in her calmness, there was something that made Avery uneasy. She wasn't the type to beg for leniency or soften her stance, and in some way that left him feeling unsettled. When it was time for his ruling, Judge Avery found himself making a decision that surprised even him. He issued a fine far beyond the usual range for this kind of offense, almost as if to prove a point. He justified it as an attempt to maintain consistency in his courtroom. No one should be treated differently based on the type of person they were or their demeanor. Simone's composed, almost distant, presence in the courtroom, to him, seemed to defy expectations, making him feel the need to impose a stricter penalty to maintain order and discipline. As Simone received the judgment without protest and walked out of the courtroom, the air seemed to shift. Avery couldn't put his finger on it, but something about the whole interaction didn't sit right. He had seen many defendants in his time, but none like her. The confidence she exuded, the way she accepted the ruling, stirred something in him. It wasn't guilt, but something akin to doubt, a feeling that perhaps there was more to this woman than met the eye. For the rest of the day, the fine he had imposed lingered in his mind. Was it too much? Did he overstep? Yet, as a judge, he was simply doing his job, wasn't he? He shrugged it off. But little did he know, that fine would be the first step in a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about fairness, justice, and leadership. The day after the court hearing, Simone's name began to make headlines, not for the reasons she expected. Local news stations and social media were abuzz with discussions about the fine she had received. Some were quick to defend Judge Avery, claiming he had been simply following the law and ensuring consistency in his rulings. But many others felt the ruling was unnecessarily harsh, even unjust, considering the circumstances. A few commentators mentioned that it felt as though the fine was a disproportionate response to Simone's calm and respectful demeanor. Simone's friends and supporters were quick to rally around her. Calls and messages of encouragement flooded her inbox, offering moral support, but also expressing concern over the unfairness of the judgment. Simone, ever composed, didn't react immediately. She knew how to navigate these waters, and this was not the first time she had been the subject of public scrutiny. However, this situation felt different. She wasn't just a private citizen here. The fine had now put a spotlight on her work as a civil rights advocate, and people were starting to notice. What the public didn't know was that Simone wasn't simply an advocate for equality. She had a significant, albeit less public, role in shaping leadership within the military. Her work was highly regarded by military generals and leaders, many of whom she had personally trained in the principles of inclusive leadership and fair decision-making. Over the years, Simone had developed a reputation as one of the most respected diversity consultants in the country. She had designed training programs for high-ranking military officials, where she guided them through deep, often uncomfortable conversations about bias, privilege, and leadership in a diverse world. The juxtaposition of Simone's public image as a civil rights leader and the judgment she had just received from Judge Avery sparked even more debate. Some questioned whether the judge, despite his prominent role in the judicial system, truly understood the importance of equality in his own courtroom. His decision to impose the fine seemed to stand in direct contrast to the work that Simone had been doing behind closed doors with the military, influencing some of the highest-ranking leaders in the country. For the first time, Judge Avery felt a pang of doubt about his decision. Though his courtroom was meant to be impartial, this case felt personal in a way that no other had before. He couldn't ignore the growing whispers in the press, or the discomfort he felt as he revisited the details of Simone's case. He had made a snap judgment, but now, as the consequences of that decision unfolded, he realized he might have missed something important. What was it about Simone that made her different from the others he had encountered? Why did her calm presence leave such an indelible mark on him? Simone, meanwhile, went about her life as usual, but the media storm following the fine was far from over. The question lingered: who was the woman behind the headlines, and what had Judge Avery missed? Simone Carter had long since grown accustomed to the media's fascination with her career. As a leader in the field of diversity training, particularly within the military, she was no stranger to attention. But this time, the headlines felt different. It wasn't just about her role as an advocate for equality. It was about the way she had been treated in the courtroom. The fine, though minor in legal terms, seemed to amplify something much bigger. As the media coverage gained momentum, Simone couldn't help but reflect on the irony of it all. She had spent years educating military generals and top leaders on the importance of fair decision-making, only to be on the receiving end of a questionable judgment from a judge she now learned little about. Determined to understand the full scope of the situation, Simone did something that surprised even herself. She started researching Judge Avery. She wasn't the type to seek revenge or escalate conflicts, but something about this particular case stirred a deeper curiosity. There had to be more to the man who had so harshly ruled against her. Simone dug into Avery's background. She learned that he had been a respected figure in the local judicial system for over 20 years. His career was spotless, and he had built a reputation for fairness, particularly when dealing with high-profile cases. But it wasn't just his legal career that caught her attention. It was his involvement in military justice reform. Avery had been working alongside the armed forces for several years, helping to oversee judicial processes within the military system. The more Simone read, the more a thought began to form in her mind. Avery wasn't just a judge. He had connections to the very circles she had spent years trying to influence. Simone knew she had to dig deeper. She reached out to some of the military leaders she had trained, confirming that Judge Avery had participated in several high-level military programs on leadership and judicial integrity. This was unexpected. She had worked closely with generals and military officers to improve their understanding of equality and fairness in their ranks. But how could Avery, someone so entrenched in these initiatives, have missed the very principles she had been teaching? She couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief. Simone's mind raced as she pieced together the picture. Avery had seen firsthand how military leaders struggled with their own biases, and yet, here he was, unable to recognize the biases at play in his own courtroom. Was this oversight a result of personal prejudice, or was it simply the blind spot of someone who had never truly questioned his own worldview? The more Simone thought about it, the more she realized that his unawareness of the power of unconscious bias was exactly why her work with military leaders had been so important in the first place. It wasn't just a missed opportunity. It was a wake-up call. Simone knew she had to confront this, but how? Could she challenge a man so deeply entrenched in the very systems she sought to change? Would he even listen? As Simone mulled over her next steps, she realized there was one undeniable truth. If she wanted to understand why Avery had made that ruling, she would need to face him directly. Simone's work behind the scenes had always been one of her most significant accomplishments, though it remained largely unnoticed by the general public. While many knew her as a passionate civil rights advocate and public speaker, only a select few understood the true extent of her influence. She had spent years building a reputation within the military, designing leadership programs that challenged the thinking of the highest-ranking officers. Her workshops weren't just about teaching generals and commanders the basics of diversity. They were about reshaping the way they understood power, authority, and fairness. The military, often seen as a bastion of tradition and hierarchy, had made remarkable strides toward inclusivity under her guidance. Simone's approach was rigorous. She didn't just lecture. She facilitated intense, reflective discussions, pushing officers to confront their own biases and rethink their assumptions about leadership. Her programs delved deep into topics such as privilege, unconscious bias, and the intersections of race, gender, and power. It wasn't always easy for the generals to face these uncomfortable truths, but Simone's ability to create a safe space for vulnerability allowed for transformative change. Her work with the military had resulted in measurable shifts in the way leaders interacted with their subordinates and made decisions. Many of the generals who had gone through her program spoke highly of how her teachings had redefined their leadership styles. It was this very work that had earned Simone her position as a trusted advisor to some of the most powerful figures in the armed forces. Yet, despite her significant impact, very few outside of these circles knew the full scope of her influence. Judge Avery, on the other hand, had no idea. As a judicial figure who had worked with military personnel for years, he was aware of the growing emphasis on diversity and fairness within the armed forces. He had attended numerous seminars on judicial integrity and fairness, many of which Simone had helped shape. But he had always been an outsider to the more intimate conversations about bias that took place in those workshops. He had never participated in the raw, often difficult discussions that Simone facilitated. Discussions that went beyond theory and got to the heart of the issue: how deeply ingrained biases can distort judgment and decision-making. Simone's discoveries about Avery's connections to military justice reform didn't just confirm what she suspected, they opened her eyes to the complexity of the situation. Avery, with his prominent position in the legal system, should have understood the importance of the work she did. Instead, he seemed to be oblivious to the very issues that had been at the core of her career. It became clear to Simone that this wasn't just about a courtroom ruling. It was about a fundamental misunderstanding of what true equality and fairness meant in both civilian and military leadership. Simone had always known that the work she did in those closed-door military sessions was more than just training. It was about dismantling the unspoken barriers that kept people from seeing each other as equals. And now, it seemed, she had an unexpected opportunity to confront those very barriers in Judge Avery's world. But the question remained: would he be willing to confront his own biases, or would he simply dismiss the lessons she had been teaching for years? Simone Carter didn't shy away from difficult conversations. In fact, she often welcomed them, believing that true change could only come when people were forced to confront uncomfortable truths. And this situation, with Judge Avery, felt like an opportunity to spark exactly that kind of transformation. But instead of taking the path of public confrontation or continuing to question the judge's decision from afar, Simone chose a more direct approach. She would offer him the chance to see firsthand the type of work she had been doing with military leaders, and perhaps, in doing so, help him understand the impact of her teachings on real-world decision-making. She crafted a thoughtful invitation, one that was both respectful and firm. Simone knew that Avery's connection to the military made him an ideal candidate for her upcoming diversity and leadership training session, which was specifically designed for high-ranking officers and judges who had influence over military policy and court decisions. It wasn't just about racial equality or gender inclusion. It was about how to make fair and informed decisions in environments that were often fraught with unconscious biases. If Avery could see the depth of her work and how transformative it had been for military leaders, perhaps he would recognize where his own blind spots had led him astray. The invitation was simple, but direct. Dear Judge Avery, I would like to extend an invitation for you to attend one of my upcoming leadership sessions with high-ranking military officials. The work we're doing on diversity, fairness, and bias is reshaping the way leaders think about authority and decision-making, and I believe your participation could offer valuable insights into how we might collaborate in the future. I hope you will consider joining us." Simone didn't expect an immediate response. People like Judge Avery were often busy with their own agendas, and she knew that he might be hesitant to step out of his comfort zone and into a world so different from his own. But to her surprise, within a few days, Avery replied. His message was polite, yet tinged with skepticism. "Thank you for the invitation, Ms. Carter. I'll admit, I'm not sure what to expect from this kind of session, but I am willing to attend and learn. I'll see you soon." Simone couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Avery's willingness to at least consider her invitation was a step in the right direction, but she also knew that attending the session wouldn't be easy for him. The work she did wasn't designed to coddle those in power. It was about challenging them to rethink their assumptions and confront the biases they might not even know they had. She wasn't going to let him off the hook with just a passive attendance. Simone intended to make this a transformative experience. As the date of the training approached, Simone prepared herself. She knew it would be uncomfortable, not just for Judge Avery, but for many of the military leaders in the room who had never had to face their own biases so directly. But it was this discomfort, she believed, that could lead to real change. The question was whether Avery would be open enough to let the experience change him, or if he would cling to his old beliefs and miss the opportunity altogether. The day of the training session arrived, and Judge Avery found himself in a room filled with military generals and high-ranking officials, men and women who had spent their careers climbing the ranks of the armed forces. Though Avery had attended numerous legal seminars over the years, this was different. He was no longer a judge sitting on the sidelines, observing and analyzing. Today, he was a participant in something entirely new, a workshop on diversity, inclusion, and leadership led by none other than Simone Carter. As he walked into the room, Avery couldn't help but notice the seriousness of the atmosphere. The room was quiet, expectant. The generals, all veterans of conflict and strategy, were seated in a semicircle, looking more like students than commanding officers. Simone stood at the front, poised and confident, her presence commanding attention without a single word. She had an air about her that suggested she was used to guiding powerful people toward uncomfortable truths, and Avery instantly understood that this was not going to be a typical seminar. Simone welcomed everyone and immediately set the tone. "Today," she began, her voice steady, "we are going to talk about power, how it's used, how it's abused, and how it's shaped by our unconscious biases." She paused, letting the words sink in. None of us are exempt from bias. The only question is whether we choose to recognize it and learn from it. Avery shifted in his seat, feeling a twinge of discomfort. It wasn't that he disagreed with her. He understood the theory. It was that he had never had to confront these issues head-on in such an intense, personal way. In his courtroom, the law was clear-cut, or so he had always believed. Here, it felt like the lines were blurry, and for the first time, Avery began to wonder how his own judgments might have been colored by the same biases Simone was talking about. The session began with a series of case studies. Each one was a real-life scenario, stories of decisions made by military leaders, both good and bad, that had been influenced by unconscious biases. Some of the stories were eye-opening, others deeply uncomfortable. Simone asked the group to break into smaller discussion groups and analyze how race, gender, and socioeconomic background had influenced the decisions being made in each case. Avery, initially reserved, found himself pulled into the discussion, listening as generals shared their personal experiences and struggles with bias in leadership. One general, a man in his 50s with decades of experience, admitted that he had often felt more lenient toward male soldiers, unconsciously believing that women weren't as capable of leadership in high-stress situations. Another shared how he had unintentionally ignored valuable insights from soldiers of color simply because they didn't fit the image of what a leader should look like. The vulnerability in the room was palpable. People were confronting their own failings in ways they never had before. Simone's role was clear. She wasn't just a facilitator of discussion. She was the guide, the mirror reflecting back the uncomfortable truths that many in the room had spent years avoiding. As the discussions unfolded, Avery's mind began to race. For the first time, he wondered how his own biases had played a role in his courtroom decisions. Had he been too quick to judge, too blinded by his own sense of authority to see the underlying dynamics at play in the cases he presided over? As the day progressed, Avery felt his perspective shift. He had come in expecting to observe, perhaps learn a few things. But now, he found himself in the midst of a profound reckoning. This wasn't just an intellectual exercise. It was a call to action. The question wasn't whether he would walk away with new knowledge. It was whether he would take what he learned and apply it in his own work, in his own life. By the end of the day, Judge Avery was exhausted, not just physically, but mentally. The discussions had been intense, and the atmosphere was charged with emotions that he wasn't used to dealing with in his usual work. The generals, many of whom had held their positions for years, had opened up about their biases and the ways those biases had affected their leadership. Some had even admitted to making decisions that, in hindsight, they regretted. Decisions shaped by preconceived notions rather than clear judgment. It was raw, it was uncomfortable, and it was exactly what Avery needed to see. The session had concluded, but Avery couldn't shake the weight of what he had learned. Simone had a unique way of making complex concepts feel personal, even to someone like him, who had prided himself on his objectivity. And as the group slowly filtered out of the room, Avery lingered, hesitant to leave. His mind was racing, his thoughts circling back to the courtroom, where he had been so certain of his decision the day he found Simone. Simone had already gathered her materials, preparing to leave for the day when she noticed Avery standing off to the side, clearly lost in thought. She approached him, giving him a moment to collect himself before speaking. "Judge Avery," she said quietly, "how are you feeling?" Avery looked up, his expression softening as he met her gaze. "I don't know where to begin," he admitted. "I've spent my entire career thinking that I understood fairness, that I was making objective decisions. But today, I realize that I've been blind to my own biases. I've been blind to how much they shape the judgments I make. And I don't think I truly understood what it meant to lead with fairness until now." Simone nodded, understanding exactly where he was coming from. It's not easy to face those truths, especially when they challenge everything you've built your career on. But acknowledging it is the first step. Avery ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "But how do I fix it? How do I go back to my courtroom after this? I feel like I've been making the same mistakes over and over, without even realizing it." Simone's voice was gentle but firm. "It's a process. A long one. But the most important thing is that you've seen it now. You're not walking away from here the same person who walked in. You've taken the first step towards changing your approach. It's going to take time, but you can start by rethinking how you approach every case. Challenge yourself. Ask yourself how your own biases may be influencing your decisions before you make them." Avery nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. He had thought of himself as fair. He had assumed that his decisions were based solely on facts and evidence. But now, he couldn't help but see how the subtle biases he carried with him had colored every decision he made, even when he thought he was being impartial. I don't know if I'm ready to change everything overnight," he said, a note of vulnerability in his voice. "But I want to try. I want to be better." Simone smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. That's all anyone can ask for, the willingness to try. As Avery left the session that day, he felt a sense of both unease and hope. He knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in his career, he was determined to confront the biases he had once overlooked. He wasn't sure exactly how he would apply everything he had learned, but he knew one thing for certain. This moment had shifted something inside him. And that shift, however small, was the beginning of a new path forward. Over the next few weeks, Judge Avery found himself revisiting everything he had learned during the training. The weight of the experience lingered, not in a burdensome way, but as a catalyst for change. It was easy to ignore the subtle influences of bias when it wasn't something you actively confronted on a daily basis. But now, Avery couldn't unsee the ways in which it had shaped his decisions. Every case he presided over felt different, as though he were seeing it with new eyes that were no longer clouded by assumptions. At first, Avery made small, deliberate changes. He began asking himself tougher questions before making rulings. How had his own experiences influenced the way he viewed the defendant or the case? Had he allowed unconscious bias to influence his judgment, even in seemingly neutral cases? It wasn't always easy to answer, but it was essential for Avery to start building a new framework for his decisions. He also began keeping a journal, a practice he had never considered before. Each day, he would write about the cases he had presided over, reflecting on his reasoning, and whether bias had played a role in his conclusions. It was a humbling exercise, one that forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own behavior. But with each entry, Avery felt a sense of clarity. He was no longer just a judge issuing rulings. He was a judge who was actively working to improve his own understanding of fairness and equality. Simone's words from that day in the training session echoed in his mind. Challenge yourself. And challenge himself he did. Avery began applying the same principles he had learned in the diversity training to his courtroom. He sought to be more intentional in his interactions with defendants, more thoughtful about the way he communicated his rulings, and more aware of the impact his decisions could have on those standing before him. It wasn't about being soft or lenient. It was about ensuring that his decisions were rooted in fairness, without the subtle influence of bias. Avery also took it a step further. He reached out to Simone to discuss the possibility of launching a similar training program for other judges. He wasn't content to let his own journey be the end of it. If his experience could help others in the legal system recognize their own blind spots, then perhaps it would lead to broader change. Simone, for her part, was impressed by the transformation she saw in Avery. It wasn't just that he had acknowledged his biases. It was that he had taken active steps to remedy them, not as a one-time fix, but as an ongoing commitment. She had always known that change could come from within the systems themselves, but seeing it firsthand in someone like Avery was encouraging. It gave her hope that real, lasting change was possible, even in institutions that had long resisted it. Together, Simone and Avery began working on initiatives that would bring awareness to bias and fairness in the legal system, drawing on their shared expertise in leadership and justice. They presented workshops, collaborated on research, and pushed for reforms that would help reshape how both the military and the judiciary approached equality. The unlikely encounter between a black woman and a white judge had turned into a powerful partnership. What began as a courtroom encounter, marked by a harsh fine and a moment of unconscious bias, had evolved into something far greater, a chance to reshape the very systems of justice they both cared so deeply about. And as Avery walked into his courtroom each day, he did so with a new understanding. That true justice wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about constantly striving to be fair, to be aware, and to always challenge the assumptions that clouded judgment.